Well, good afternoon to all of you. My name is Jeroen de Wolf. I'm the director of the Institute of European Studies. It is my pleasure to welcome you all to today's online event in our Zoom series on how the coronavirus impacted Europe. Today, we will look at the impact of the virus on the EU economy and on the ongoing discussion on the EU Recovery Fund. And we do so with two guests, Barry Eichengreen and Daniel Gros. I would like to thank both Barry and Daniel for making time to be with us today. Now to introduce our guests to you. Barry Eichengreen is the George and Helen Pardee Professor of Economics and also Professor of Political Science here at the University of California, Berkeley, where he has taught since 1987. In 1997-98, he was Senior Policy Advisor at the International Monetary Fund, and he was also the recipient of a Doctor Honoris Causa from the American University in Paris. Daniel Gros has been Director of the Center for European Policy Studies since the year 2000. Daniel previously worked at the IMF and collaborated with the European Commission as an economic advisor. Last semester, Daniel was a visiting professor here at Cal, but meanwhile, Daniel is back from Europe and he is joining us today from Europe. So thanks to both of you for making time to join us for today's conversation. And before we start our discussion on the impact on the economy of the coronavirus outbreak, allow me to reach out to you with a personal question and ask how you were personally affected by the coronavirus outbreak. And perhaps I could start with Barry, and I would like to ask you, Barry, if you could just say a few words on how you personally were affected by the crisis in your job, but also in your personal life, your family. Barry, if you would mind doing that.
I think the main difference for me is that I have to get up earlier, and the adrenaline rush you get from speaking to an audience or participating in an event, that occurs very first thing in the morning, and it's all downhill from there. I did a event with the India Policy Forum at 7 a.m., 6:30 a.m. this morning. And when I visit with Daniel and his colleagues or other people in Europe, it's the early morning in California and late afternoon there. Beyond that, my research has been reoriented to an extent toward the pandemic. Many of us in the social sciences have moved in that direction. And it'll be interesting to see how enduring that move is. And beyond that, my cooking has become more elaborate and my spice garden has grown larger.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Barry. Let me ask the same question for Daniel. If you could unmute yourself, Daniel, and just say a few words on how the virus impacted your personal life.
Yeah, I must admit that I'm one of those who actually perhaps benefited from the virus, at least in terms of research topics. In terms of my family life, it was actually somewhat strange in the sense that my youngest son had joined me in Berkeley to visit Berkeley High, to get to know an American high school. And the day he arrived, the school went online. So that was not what we had intended to.
Right.
So the two of us lived in Berkeley, I must say, quite well throughout the entire shelter-in-place period, because we had our bikes and we had an excuse to go out doing grocery shopping every day. So in that process, my own cooking also improved. Not so much in terms of quality, but quantity. When you have a teenage son at home, the portions have to be very generous. And in terms of research, as I said, when I arrived in Berkeley, I thought I could go back to something I had done a long time ago, namely trade policy, for which, of course, the present US president had given some new food for thought. But that was, of course, all overshadowed by the crisis which came on rather suddenly, and especially suddenly, strongly in the case of Europe, about which I presume we will talk later.
Yeah, thank you so much to both of you. Now, before I give the word to my colleague Akasemi, I wanted to ask both of you to comment in general terms about the impact of the coronavirus outbreak on the world economy and on Europe in particular. I do recall an interview with Angela Merkel where she used the following sentence: "We are facing the most serious economic crisis in the history of the European Union." The most serious economic crisis in the history of the European Union. Is that something you could agree with? And maybe I start with Daniel and then we go to Barry. Daniel?
Yes, but I mean, the European Union is not that old. So in the sense that perhaps we should ask Barry whether this would also qualify as the most serious economic crisis in the history of the United States, which is a bit longer, that history. But that is true. And as we all know, I mean, there's this famous dictum, one of the founding fathers of Europe, Robert Schuman, who said that the Europe that we have is the sum of all the solutions which the European community can bring to crisis. And we see that dictum is once more true right now. Luckily, I would say after a very slow start, it now seems that with this new fund, which we might be talking about later, at least a concrete political signal has been given that there's a willingness to express solidarity and to help those hardest hit by the crisis.
Yeah. Barry?
Mrs. Merkel is famous for choosing her language carefully, and she's a scientist. She looks at the data before she speaks. So I do not think she was overstating the matter. It's a little hard to compare this crisis with crises past because this crisis is not over. And there's still a scenario in which Europe crushes the virus and recovers more quickly than expected. But there are also alternative scenarios. So we were going to have to wait and see. I do think there are many striking contrasts between the US and Europe, but one of them is that Europe has the potential to make something positive out of this crisis, as Daniel just described, and I see no such possibility yet in the United States.
Right now, yeah. Very good. Let me pass on then to my colleague Akasemi for her first question. Akasemi.
So my first question for both of you has to do with the impact of the pandemic on the finances of subnational entities. So as we know in the United States, here in California, that local governments and state governments have really had to carry a heavy burden when it came to kind of the impact on their finances. In Europe as well, we know that cities and states and Länder, for example, in the state of in Germany, they have also borne sort of disproportionate burdens. Could you, both of you, say something about how the European recovery plan addresses subnational units and the challenges that the pandemic posed to their finances, and then perhaps compare it with the US context?
And maybe Daniel, if you could start, and then we go to Barry.
I would actually think that in Europe, the challenge is less at the subnational level than at the national level. I would think that in most European countries, the subnational level really has an ironclad guarantee from the national level. It's very much intertwined with it. and therefore does not really face the same problems. Actually, I found it interesting that there is this problem in the United States, with now states of the United States paying very high risk premia, which are not far from those facing countries in Europe. But I would say in Europe, it's a question of the national, and maybe Barry can say more about this, the difference between having a central bank standing behind every government or not. But the challenge going forward will be much more at the national level in Europe. That would be my conclusion.
Mm-hmm. Barry?
Julia muted me, so I had to unmute myself there. I think a big difference, well, one difference is that national governments in Europe are in some cases constrained or could be constrained in the absence of continued central bank support in their ability to borrow. And I see no such constraint looming for the federal government in the United States. As I understand the outlines of the recovery plan at the EU level, money will go from the EU to the national governments, which can turn around and distribute it to regional municipal governments as they see fit. And that brings us to the second difference, which is that in Europe, there are very few cases, I can't think of any offhand, where the national government is actively at war with regional governments or city mayors or the like. And in the US, we have this problem of active distrust on the part of the majority party in the Senate of many state and local leaders, which makes it hard to have that kind of cooperation that hopefully will be possible in Europe.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I wanted to follow up with a different question and going back to a comment that Daniel made earlier. So you mentioned solidarity, right? We will speak in a couple of minutes about the plan for an EU recovery fund. But let's go back, Daniel, for a minute to the very beginning of the crisis. And where we could see that the first reaction to the crisis was the closure of borders all over Europe. And the EU Commission was, we can say until recently, largely absent. There seemed to be virtually no coordination at the EU level, which did of course give the EU citizens also a certain message, almost as if there's a real crisis, you cannot count on the EU Commission. You can't count only on your national government, which is of course a very problematic message that if you think about it from an EU perspective, of course. So did this initial absence of the EU Commission, did it surprise you, Daniel, from your experience?
No. The EU doesn't have a government. It's not a body which is made to react quickly to anything almost. It is more a rule-setting mechanism, setting a framework for the national governments to act. And that framework had no script at all for such a crisis. Just wasn't foreseen, right? The part of the EU mechanism which foresaw an economic crisis worked quite easily. The fiscal rules have a special article in there which says in case there's a major economic disturbance, they can be ignored, done. The state aid rules, same thing, right? So that was the easy part. But nobody had ever thought that there would be a need for closures for pandemic. So the first reaction was, of course, everybody for himself. But then I think actually very quickly a general realization set in that is not in the interest of anybody.
Right.
And they were actually basically, everybody was reaching out to the Commission to coordinate, not to impose a solution, right?
Yeah.
But to coordinate member states.
Mm-hmm.
And that it has done well. These things, for example, like Germany halting the export of medical equipment to other countries.
Right.
That was basically also just in the crisis, because that is foreseen in the German legal framework, that this happened automatically, right? And before somebody thought, oh, but this also implies that some stuff cannot be delivered to our EU partners, right? It just took a couple of days.
Yeah.
And when they realized that in Berlin, of course, it was immediately rescinded. In the meantime, of course, the public relations damage had been done. But I would say I'm not surprised by the slow reaction. And I find actually that it has later turned out pretty well, and something that we can discuss later. What I find interesting is that in the end, the reaction of almost all EU member countries to the epidemic part has been very, very similar.
Yeah. Yeah, and maybe as Barry Eichengreen, maybe an opportunity to learn, Barry, maybe a short follow-up?
Yeah, I agree. The European Commission doesn't have a public health service. It runs some schools and for its civil servants in Brussels, and that's about it. Yeah. So the only place that Europe's citizens could turn was to their national public health services. Right. And the like. Initially, I do think there was a short period where people were asking, where is the EU now, where there weren't enough visible signs of that new initiatives would be coming. But that problem has now been amply addressed, or there are signs that it will be amply addressed. It'll be interesting going forward to look at Eurobarometer surveys and the like when they ask questions about trust in the European Union and its institutions, how that will have been affected by the pandemic. That's actually something, that one aspect of the research that I've been doing. How have epidemics past affected trust in government and leaders? And the answer is negatively by and large.
Yeah.
But more negatively where the response has been weak and incompetent, not entirely surprisingly. So I think that negative reaction will be more evident in the United States than in the EU. Different European countries are different in terms of their demographics, their national health services and the like. So a one-size-fits-all response would not have been appropriate. The Commission ultimately did exactly what is lacking in the United States, where similarly demographics and healthcare differ across states, which is for the federal government to set standards for things like when schools should reopen them, reopen them, for those intelligence standards then to be implemented with local conditions in mind by the individual states. That's the direction in which Europe is moving, I think, and we have yet to move.
Yeah. Thank you, Barry. Let me just, before I go back to Akasemi for her next question, remind the audience that you're all encouraged to participate in the event by sending your own questions through the chat function. And in the second part of the discussion, we will pass on some of these questions to our guests. But going back to you, Akasemi, for your next question.
So my question is about the EU Recovery Fund in response to the pandemic. Could both of you address sort of lessons learned in terms of really the new instruments for economic and financial governance that are now present in the EU area as a result of the last financial crisis about 10 years ago? What are some of the lessons learned that we see or don't see at work in the new EU Recovery Fund?
Maybe Daniel first, and Daniel, maybe you could also give a bit background information on the EU Recovery Fund, because not everyone in the audience may be familiar with what is exactly being discussed.
the recovery fund, by the way, does not exist yet. So it's a proposal at this stage. Can I perhaps take one little step backwards and Barry again can comment on this? You know, General always fight the last war. And sometimes that's a good thing, sometimes it's a bad thing. What policymakers thought they had learned from 2008-9 was that if you have a financial crisis, you throw liquidity at the markets to calm them down, broadly speaking. And that lesson was learned, I think, globally, and it was also applied in Europe by the ECB. And I think that's was the first step, which was very important in end of March, April, when it looked as if the financial market would drive the EU apart and countries would face, on top of the epidemic, a financial crisis. So in that sense, I think the lesson was learned, and it was applied also in the European context, although there are some restrictions on the kind of things the ECB do, which do not exist in the United States. What remained was the fact that there were some countries who thought, okay, we are hard hit. They are sitting up there in the north. For whatever reason, they don't seem to have a big problem, and nobody's helping us. But if we are in the European Union, should be good for something. We need some solidarity. And to which the first answer was, you can get some credits, but that's it. We have to look after our own citizens who don't like to hand out money free to ladies customers. Right? I'm exaggerating a bit. That was summit meetings which were not very fruitful until a couple of weeks ago, well, no, more than a couple of weeks ago now, Angela Merkel changed her mind. And she said that I have understood now that just giving Southern European countries, which already have a very high debt level, more credits means that level goes even up. Right? And in the end becomes unbearable. Maybe it's time to change tack and give them also something which is a gift, a transfer, right? Which used to be anathema in Germany. In Germany and some other country, and some other Northern European countries. Now, the interesting aspect of her agreement with Macron that something like this should be done to the tune of 500 billion is that in Germany itself, somehow, I would say, the entire political elite said, yes, you're right, good idea. So something which seemed to have been a taboo and a red line somehow fell. And not just because she said it, because her power is really restricted outside crisis, but the entire political establishment followed. And that means we have a very strong support from one of the biggest countries for this idea. Now, how to implement it, that's another question. We have this recovery fund which the Commission proposed. So they took the 500 billion, Macron and Merkel said would be enough, and said, okay, let's add another 250 billion, but in the form of credits. Who knows why suddenly credits? Okay, I don't want to discuss that. And then, of course, it should go only to countries who do some reforms, vaguely speaking. Okay, but all of this, and that's the key part, this fund has to be approved by all member countries. Even Luxembourg, Latvia, whatever. And there's, how should I say, not the gang, what they call the frugal four countries who think that that is going a step too far. Basically, the Netherlands are the ones who say this most loudly. And that is this open question still. Will we really get an agreement on a recovery fund of that size with transfer sets of credits and with very limited conditionality attached to it?
Maybe Barry, you could follow up?
My bet would be yes,
Okay.
we will get some. Yeah.
Yeah, because the connection, Daniel, unfortunately is not so good, but we could more or less, I think, understand your point. Maybe Barry, if you could follow up at this point.
Okay.
I agree that a very important difference from 2008, 2009 is that Europe now has a proper central bank, that understands it's not simply there to keep inflation at 2%, but it's also there to backstop financial markets and help deal with emergencies in a all hands on deck situation. I think an second important difference is Europe better recognizes now and can take steps now to strengthen its banking system. So the banks have not been a problem yet. Problems are coming, but because of the single supervisor, which is housed within the European Central Bank, and other reforms, the banking system is more robust than it was during the global financial crisis. Third thing we learned is that the bailout fund that the Euro area created after the global financial crisis, the European Stability Mechanism, is not built for all seasons. If you're going to borrow from it, you've got to go through lengthy negotiations. You've got to have a program, an agreement, IMF-style agreement with the Commission in place. There's all kinds of burdensome conditionality attached. So it's not a mechanism designed for this kind of crisis. All those are things we either learned from that earlier crisis or are learning about that earlier crisis from this one. In addition to what Daniel said about the recovery fund, I would add one point. There's the question of whether this recovery fund is a one-off or not, whether it's an exceptional 750 billion euro package for a once-in-a-lifetime pandemic, the most serious crisis in 80 years, or however you want to put it, or whether it's a meaningful step in the direction of a EU fiscal capacity that will be permanent or not. So people refer to this as Europe's Hamiltonian movement after Alexander Hamilton in 1790. I ask myself, is this a true Hamiltonian moment, 1790 style, or is this Hamilton the musical? And we don't know yet. I think the tale will be told by whether there is a dedicated source of revenues or funding for the recovery fund. If there's an EU digital tax or an EU financial transactions tax or an expanded EU carbon tax, revenues that flow directly to the European Union, and the EU doesn't have to go cup in hand begging for funds every year or every 7 years to the members to fund this common fiscal capacity, then it'll be a true Hamiltonian movement.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Let me perhaps follow up with an expression that Daniel just used. He mentioned the frugal four, right? The countries like Austria, Denmark, and most vocally the Netherlands, who clearly have displayed lack of trust, right? The lack of trust that political leaders in the South will spend this money wisely. And I would like to hear your thoughts on these so-called frugal four. And the reason I bring it up also is that in an earlier Zoom conversation we had on the COVID outbreak, we had an opportunity to speak with an economist from Italy. And to my surprise, actually, he said that he had understanding for these Northern European governments in being reluctant. And in his view, there was a clear risk that the Italian government, for instance, he mentioned the case of Alitalia that has been bailed out so many times. And he said there is a risk that this money will not be spent wisely. But where do you stand? What are your thoughts about these frugal four and their concerns? Maybe Barry first and then Daniel?
Sherwin, are you representing the Netherlands here?
Just wondering, because
yeah, I think as with many difficult questions, the answer is complicated. Mm-hmm. There is a combination of old prejudices and real worries. Mm-hmm. In this case, I am of the mind that the old prejudices are probably dominant, that we Northern Europeans are responsible and those Southern Europeans are not, and irresponsibility will rear its head out as it has in other contexts. I think that's a partial picture at best. Italy, for example, is doing some things very badly, like growing its economy, which it hasn't done in a couple of decades, and it's doing other things very well, like running primary budget surpluses, which it's been doing consistently. The worries about moral hazard and corruption or lack of transparency or whatever you want to call it are valid, but there are circumstances where you have to regard, certain problems or worries as tolerable because the stakes are high enough. And I think here, both in a public health sense and in a European solidarity sense, the stakes are high.
Daniel, is that also your point of view?
Yeah, let me perhaps make a couple of points, and then I think it would be interesting to hear from Barry about the history of transfers in the United States, which I think were not associated with strong controls on how the money was used by the recipient states. Now, to be open, I think it is not reasonable to presume that because of some EU conditions, the Italian government will somehow become more efficient at spending its money. That's unlikely to happen. And that cannot be imposed from the outside. So whatever you think about its efficiency, I think it will not change. Now, the Frugal Four, especially the Netherlands, there's one difference there. I think you have, first of all, this red line, which is actually a red line within a party. And I'm not so sure that if that red line was actually broken, like in Germany, that actually it would turn out to be a Maginot, right? Something which is more imaginary can be circumvented. One difference is that in Germany, you can get general agreement that Germany, the country, has a systemic responsibility. Whereas the Dutch and the other small countries can say, right, we are not responsible for the big thing, right? We just want to make sure that our money is well spent. So that's why they have a somewhat different point of view. So I would say I can understand that they do some of this grandstanding. It is actually not addressed, I believe, in all cases to the majority of the population, but it's very often just a part of an inter-party or intra-coalition game. And stepping back from these details, I think we should ask ourselves, if we think about something which expresses solidarity, should we then insist that the money be wisely spent and controlled? Or should we do it more, as I said, my impressions of the United States, that you just give the money because there's a shock. Not many questions asked.
Right. Right.
I'm not sure, actually.
Yeah.
I'm not entirely sure. A lot of federal transfers to the states go for unemployment insurance and Medicare and Medicaid. States differ in exactly how they spend their Medicare and Medicaid funding. They differ in how generous or not their unemployment insurance schemes are, but the money largely goes for that type of program, subject to the state's decision about exactly how to structure and administer it. States get differential amounts of money depending on whether they have research laboratories or industries that can get government contracts. The University of California gets money for co-running the national laboratories, the Lawrence Berkeley Lab, and things like that. So I think a lot of the money is earmarked in a general sense. And a lot of the transfers between states are on the revenue side. So that's a big difference between us and Europe. That Connecticut transfers a lot of money to West Virginia because incomes are higher and subject to a higher marginal tax rate in Connecticut than in West Virginia. And then the money gets sprinkled over all the states on the spending side.
Yeah, yeah.
And was that similar during the Great Depression under Roosevelt?
So the federal government was small before the New Deal. And I think a lot of the money did go towards specific programs in the individual states, be they the Tennessee Valley Authority, which went to a specific geographical area, or the Works Progress Administration, where it went toward certain kinds of public employment. But I should go back and look.
Yeah. I guess, Sammy, we go back to you for your new question.
Now the question that I have concerns the role of schools in the economy. So a recent headline that I saw in the Atlantic looked at Sweden and noted that although Sweden's schools for younger children had remained open during the pandemic, that they had not reaped gains in terms of their economic growth and had not been able to avoid the shrinking of their own economy. Of course, in the United States, there are sort of many calls to reopen schools, and these are juxtaposed with concerns about safety and transmission rates increasing. Could you say something about European policies on reopening of schools and its relationship to the economic recovery?
I wish I could.
Daniel?
I really don't know. I know that even within Germany, different states, different länder have different policies. All I have learned is that the scientific evidence on whether schools are actually spreading the disease or not is very thin on the ground. So I really don't know on what basis politicians have to take these decisions. My impression was that at the beginning they just, when in doubt, let's close it down. But even the opening now is very haphazard, almost different from school to school. And the scientific evidence, as far as I know, is just not there.
I think the case where the best job has been done, as I understand it, is Denmark, where they did a lot of thinking and planning before reopening schools, and they have done so successfully as a result of that. Detailed planning at the national level and then implementation varies locally depending on local conditions, whether you're urban or rural, what the school building looks like, and so forth. I'm a little bit mystified by the push in the United States to reopen schools. I guess the right way to interpret it, I don't know. My cynical mind says the right way to interpret it is that people who are taking care of their kids at home will be able to go back to work, and that'll make the economy look better temporarily. But that's an upside down way of managing the process.
When I look at questions from the audience, I see that there is an interest in broadening this discussion a little bit beyond Europe. And one question that comes up is what country, what economy will benefit perhaps most from this crisis? And a country that is often mentioned is China, that somehow China will take advantage of all of this to strengthen its position in the world economy. Is that something you share, Daniel?
What do you mean taking advantage? They're doing their best. Now they have a dictatorial system, so they were a bit slow to accept the bad news, but then once they did, right, they locked down a province which is 50 million people. Then later, what was it, a couple of weeks ago in Beijing, they tested 10 million people in a couple of weeks, right? So they have massive resources to throw. That the country comes out stronger economically compared to the rest of the world, which might be doing badly. That might be the case. I just don't know, but I wouldn't call that taking advantage. they have tried to do some, what is it called, this wolf barrier diplomacy, showing probably fake videos of Italians playing the Chinese national anthem on their balconies. But I think this is stuff for newspapers, which will be forgotten in a couple of weeks.
Mm-hmm.
I think that taking advantage language, Daniel, is revealing of how the debate in the United States has evolved in the brief period since you went back to Brussels. That people talk about Cold War 2.0 and they view the strategic rivalry between the US and China as a zero-sum game. And that is the right way of thinking about things, and to only a very limited degree. To the extent that China's economy will grow this year while ours will shrink significantly, that will affect the balance of economic power and balance of other power as well. China may be in a stronger position to advance its interests relative to the US, but there are other things happening in China at the same time, like the impression the rest of the world gets from its actions in Hong Kong, the impression the rest of the world gets from its actions on the Indian border, that may be weakening its soft power and its strategic position vis-a-vis the rest of the world.
All right. The question I have from the audience has to do with globalization. Do either of you see the pandemic as leading to a reversal of globalization, in which countries have realized they need to renationalize the manufacture of drugs or PPE, that global supply chains are now unreliable or likely to be tainted by some other countries' mismanagement of the pandemic?
Barry?
To an extent, to a slight extent, I think we all understand the importance of building robust supply chains and robustness can be associated at times like this with proximity, producing the parts and components you need locally as a backup. Sorry about that. This is what happens when you don't remove your phone from your study, when it's your third Zoom call of the day. But, I think globalization is too deeply entrenched to think about it as an on or off phenomenon. That there were statements like these after 9/11 that it wouldn't be safe to have international air travel or containerization or whatever, and we responded. We now do safety theater in airports, but we also use X-rays to inspect shipping containers in ways that make us safer, and there will be a response to these threats as well.
Daniel?
I must say, I find this talk about globalization somehow being rolled back, mainly talk. I agree with Barry that the areas where there might be some more proximity, some more robust supply chains, medical and PPE equipment, that's a very small part of the economy. It is, however, intertwined, I think, in the United States with this Chinophobia. I think for the United States, globalization means China, and therefore that is not a good thing. In Europe, there's also increasingly talk about asserting European sovereignty and having European champions. That talk is very prevalent in the national security establishment. However, I don't think it will get very far for two reasons. First of all, the EU depends very much on globalization, on exports. They're basically double the share in our GDP than that of the of the United States. And the second point is that when the big guys talk about European champions, France and Germany, for example, they usually mean their own firms. And that's why all the small guys say, no, that's not really a good idea. And just to give you an idea of how that plays out in reality is, as you know, Europe at least has 2 manufacturers of 85, like 2 small countries. Have you heard a single German or French politician saying, oh, we need to make Nokia and Ericsson? So I think there the intra-European rivalry will prevent Europe from establishing A, European champions, and B, doing something which would really roll back globalization.
Mm-hmm. Let me pass on a second question from the audience to both of you. Dealing again with globalization, mentioning or questioning the implications of the current crisis on international trade and relations. And then the specific question is, will the world become more closed, given things such as travel restrictions and general mistrust? Barry, what do you think?
Barry goes first.
I certainly hope not. So when you asked me, Jeroen, at the beginning how the pandemic has affected me, like many of us, it's meant less travel. So I do miss that, the experience of running through airports and being in other countries. I find that there are aspects of staying at home and listening to the birds sing that I did not appreciate enough before I was forced to stay at home. I think that we will have to wait and see about this vaccine thing.
Mm-hmm.
We hear conflicting things about immunity, about the half-life of a vaccine, about how long the development of an effective vaccine will take. Some of us could fall out of the habit of traveling and the like permanently if it's a long time. If it's not such a long time, I expect to be back in the red carpet club.
Yeah, yeah. Daniel, you're optimistic as well in this respect?
Yeah, I think in a couple of years we'll probably back to the old routine minus some lingering effect.
Mm-hmm.
I must say I don't miss the travel much. Zoom has its advantages, I find. But for example, right now I'm already in Italy, having traveled without problems from Brussels. So I think travel is slowly recovering. I think it just forces us, having 1 year without forces us to think what's actually the value of it. Is it necessary in all cases?
As we know, as is being actively discussed in our circles, there will be a big impact, I think, on conferencing, academic conferencing, and on instruction as well. So here we're going to see permanent changes for sure. I find it very interesting how the seminars that I participate in now can draw a global audience, and the ones we are organizing for Cal in the fall can have even higher quality speakers because we don't have to pay to fly them in. So there are some positive aspects there. If we can only get the teaching up to speed the way it should be, then we'll be in good shape.
Yeah. Very good. And go back to Akasemi.
The question I have from the audience has to do with Brexit. What do both of you think the impact of Brexit will be on European recovery?
So, Akasemi, we couldn't hear your question. Can you try to?
I understood what the impact was or will be of Brexit.
On Brexit. Okay, Daniel, if you could.
Yes, Brexit.
The short answer is being snowed under.
Mm-hmm.
Right now, everybody's saying Brexit. Oh yeah, there was something.
Yeah.
And I think, especially also the discussion about the recovery fund has shown to us on the continent 27 that some things work more smoothly without the UK, because this recovery fund would probably have been impossible with the UK inside. And that's what some people said from the very beginning. Without the UK, it will actually become easier to have a more compact European Union, a more integrated European Union. And we're seeing this confirmed. So I think for the time being, I would say Brexit is the least of our worries in Brussels.
Yeah. Barry, is that your opinion as well?
Yeah, but it's a big problem in London. Brexit has always been and will remain a big negative for the UK for some time to come. But I agree that what happens in the UK will stay in the UK largely, and that if anything, the UK had traditionally been one of the proponents of the EU as a glorified free trade area. So efforts to make it something more are, if anything, facilitated by its exit.
Mm-hmm. Let me follow up with a question that is a bit unrelated, but at the same time does have a connection to COVID. It relates to today's ruling of the European Court of Justice on the case of Apple, and state support from Ireland, and it was a defeat for the European Commission, a victory for Apple. And the question I have from the audience is the following. The EU Commission released a recommendation proposing that European state COVID tax relief measures not be linked with a tax haven. How would you assess the ability of EU states to achieve this goal in light of recent ruling of the EU Court on Apple versus Ireland? Daniel, perhaps your thoughts on the Apple case?
Yeah, actually, I've followed it a bit more closely than others. Technically, it's a slap in the face of the Commission or its legal service. So apparently, they didn't get their act together. They didn't provide good enough arguments. Now, politically, I think this is a very difficult process, which I would say has had a setback, but it is likely to go ahead at snail's pace. To give you a comparison, towards the end of the 1990s, when we were going towards monetary union, people said, okay, now we need to somehow harmonize the taxation of financial capital, right, of bonds and their income that individuals have, because they can just move it around in an area with the same currency. And there, of course, the smaller countries said, over our dead bodies. Famous case was that of Austria, which had numbered accounts which were even more anonymous than the famous Swiss ones. And the Austrians used to say, we will become a people of Eurosceptics if you touch that. And after a while, it was touched. After a while, we got to a system whereby these things can be followed up. But it took 10 years.
Yeah.
So I would say, yes, this is a setback. It's very difficult, and it cannot be linked to the discussion about the fund right now. But remember, the EU is always about repeat encounters. You cannot run away, right? If 25 bring back the same argument over and over again, something will move. So I would say in 10 years, we will have managed to at least halve the problem, perhaps.
Yeah. Interesting. Barry, is that your opinion as well?
This is not a case that I've been able to follow.
Good. Then we'll go back to Akasemi. Akasemi, with a follow-up question.
So one last question from the audience. This has to do with trust in institutions. So could both of you give some conjectures, some speculation as to whether trust in institutions and government is likely to continue to fall or to increase in response to this crisis?
Daniel? Barry, go ahead. Yes, Barry.
As I mentioned before, I actually have a research paper with a couple of collaborators that looks at data from the Gallup World Polls, which has been polling people in 170 countries since 2003. And we hooked up those 700,000 observations to a data set on epidemics since 1970. And we found that there's a large and persistent negative impact of epidemic exposure during one's impressionable years only. If your country experiences an epidemic when you are between the ages of 18 and 25, which are what psychologists and sociologists and cognitive scientists refer to as the impressionable years, when people form durable impressions about political party affiliation and trust in government and so forth, there is a negative reaction that basically lasts for the rest of one's lifetime. And interesting, you don't see it for people who are younger, 10 to 17 years old when the epidemic strikes. You don't see it for people who are older, 25 to 32 years old when the epidemic hits your country. So it's at this stage where the juvenile brain is being transformed into the adult brain, and there are these chemical changes in the brain supposedly going on, where trust in government is really durably formed. So this suggests that Generation Z is going to be much less trusting of government than the generations that came before and will come after.
Interesting. Yeah. Daniel, your thoughts on this?
My thoughts are not as well supported as those of Barry. I would hope that, let's say 1 year from now, when we ask the same question we always ask people, do you trust the European institutions? That trust will have improved a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
Because, as I said, the initial reaction was weak and was perceived to be weak, but now things seem to be getting under control. And as I said at the very beginning, it seems that we have also found by coincidence that most European countries actually had a very similar set of preferences,
Mm-hmm.
which makes it easier to come together and follow a similar path.
Yeah. Well, I'm very glad to hear, Daniel, that we can conclude this event with a positive note, because indeed I look at the watch, I see it's 1 o'clock. It's time to conclude this event. I wanted to thank all of you in the audience for joining us. Also, thank you for sending us your questions. I wanted to thank my colleagues Julia and Akasemi for assisting me at today's event, but of course a big thank you to Daniel and Barry for making time, for being with us and answering all the questions. So thank you so much. And I hope to see you at future events here at the Institute of European Studies. Thank you.
Great. Enjoy the day.
Thank you. Goodbye.